Bom dia, senhor presidente. Nice to have you here.
É bom tê-lo aqui, presidente. Bom dia. Thank you.
First question.
Primeira pergunta.
We were yesterday on protest
Ontem estivemos nos protestos, manifestações,
big street with
naquela
coming on.
rua, aquela estrada, enfim, bloqueada pelos caminhoneiros. E
Now the discussion between you and the STF.
entendo que teve uma conversa entre o senhor e o STF.
So, what is
Acho que
the
foi um tanto
status
branda
of
a
this
conversa. Qual é o estado de coisas aí nesse diálogo?
O que nós tivemos na terça-feira
What we saw on Tuesday, Independence Day in
foi
Brazil,
retrato para o
was a picture for the world, a domestic portrait of what's going on here. It clearly stated that this is a democratic country. We all want the federal constitution to be complied with in all of its provisions and articles. And we, of course, cherish that which is the most sacred value for us, our liberty. Now, as regards the federal Supreme Court, yesterday I talked to former President Temer, and he is the one president who appointed Chief Justice Alexandre de Moraes to the Supreme Court. We had a talk, and he attended. Of course, he was there. I was there as well. And something that we've never seen in the market, rare event. The stock exchange market went way up. It usually goes down, speedily and rapidly. It doesn't always go up so quickly as was the case yesterday. And we also saw a drop in the US dollar of about 2.5% in the US dollar, which has a direct impact on the fuel prices as well as on our relations. So that's the positive effect, the immediate and positive effect of that dialogue. Today, Chief Justice Alexandre de Moraes repealed the arrest previously decreed against one journalist. And apparently, signs indicate that we are living new times between the executive branch and the federal Supreme Court. And we're doing pretty well and evolving very rapidly in our relations. We do have a few other, pending issues to be overcome, and I'm actually in talk about those issues with the Supreme Court. And we expect good news in the near future. We can be described as a couple that was fighting up until recently, and all of a sudden the couple overcomes their differences and enjoys peace. I was hard hit by social media yesterday because I took this gesture to draw closer to the Supreme Court. But as the head of the state, I have to think of what is best for my country. And the whole world, of course, suffered with the pandemic, not only given the sheer number of deaths, but also the inflation rate for foodstuffs. And Brazil is a very vast, very large country, not only territory-wise, but also population-wise, 210 million people. And 1/3 of the population in Brazil are poor. And if you use the Brazilian Census Bureau criteria, everyone, is well off in Brazil. That would be the policy of former administrations. I do not espouse that kind of policy or criteria. I think you can be described as being poor, middle class, or wealthy according to where you live, what you have in your fridge, and also your employment status and how much you earn. And I am clearly aware that we still have 1/3 of the population out there in Brazil that is poor, and this is an extremely rich country. And there's, of course, an interest in discussing with the Supreme Court, and that gesture, of course, after many months of clash and showdown, was precisely with a view to achieving that purpose. I would have taken a different approach if I were to think only of myself. I don't pay the bill. The poorest of the poor, the needy ones, are the ones who pay the bill. So I think we are moving pretty well and evolving in the past few days.
We spoke to some people yesterday.
Falamos com algumas pessoas ontem. As pessoas se mostraram um pouco decepcionadas primeiro, mas eu acho que entenderam que o gesto tinha por objetivo proteger os brasileiros e demonstraram apoio ao senhor, milhões de pessoas, inclusive em São Paulo e em todo o país. De modo que, na minha opinião, as pessoas entenderam o recado de que era um gesto que tinha por objetivo atender seus melhores interesses, interesses do povo. Então, o senhor acha que o povo está apoiando o senhor presidente nesse gesto,
Essas manifestações no Brasil,
The demonstrations or protests in Brazil were
a maior da história.
actually the protests were indeed the largest ever in history. And you cannot, of course,
Fotografias, não tem como você
dispute or fight against images and photographs. But again, a substantial share of the media do.
pensar apenas em mim,
If I were to think of myself only, I would
né? O soberbo andando por aí.
be walking around,
O
you know,
soberbo
in a spirit of
não tem humildade, ele
arrogance, but arrogance precedes downfall.
foi contemplado.
So I was there, I met with the crowd, and
Brasília,
things went very well in the Brazilian demonstrations. I used the same address in São Paulo, but some people did not agree, and I felt that
bafo, né?
there was this
Sopro, não queremos isso. Daí eu me acendi
blow of opposition from the crowd, and I may have exceeded a little bit, true. And that, of course, was revisited and overcome in my statement. Many people criticized my statement because they only heard it on TV. But then again, that's not worth it. You have to read the note, the statement, in its entirety. You know, 2 items, about 10 or 12 lines. And I think it was very important, this statement, because I recognize my mistake. The press says I'm taking a step back. I'm not going to fight with the press. You know, the press in Brazil is a lost battle. You know, you can't have a dialogue with them. And when I tell people to read my statement, you know, many people, a majority of people who are against the stance I took, after they read the note in its entirety, they side with us and support us. As I have always said, we need to play the game within the borders set by the Constitution. If you, of course, work and operate outside of the Constitution, then you're in for a anything goes like game, and that means a step towards dictatorship, and that's not a good thing. Look at what Chavez did in Venezuela. He corrupted the armed forces. Our military, our armed forces in Brazil will operate within the constitutional provisions as established, and I am concerned that, or people are concerned that we may operate outside of the constitutional borders by means of force. And I have increasingly shared this view and sentiment with everyone. We do not have to do anything outside of the Constitution. What the Constitution provides for, what the law provides for, is enough. And I think we are proving successful in this effort. So much so that, you know, the left wing criticized my statement the following day as an indication that we're doing things right. In Brazil, whenever the left wing takes one stance, and when they criticizes, it's a pretty good sign that I am doing the right thing and that this statement was a good one. So I do enjoy peace of mind, and I'm pretty much at ease. We often say that we have a president in Brazil who is a believer in God, a man who respects the armed forces, and owes or has a sense of loyalty towards the Brazilian people. And something that is very dear to the Brazilian people is respect to the traditional family, because the left wing had increasingly working to deteriorate these values, you know, to achieve absolute power. I mean, how can I try to destroy your family if that's my intention? Well, I'll destroy your family by working against you, against your wife, your father, etc., one by one. And of course, introducing mistrust in your house. And the fact of the matter is that the family, of course, is the very foundation of any society. It cannot possibly be deteriorated nor destroyed. And we began to see a very strong wave against the family values in 2010. And that was not the first person. For many months on end, I was the only person advocating these values and the only person to point out where the attack against the family foundation was coming from. After many months, other members of Congress, especially the evangelical Christians in Parliament, realized the situation and sided with me. And that's where my presidential campaign and the election started, way back in 2010. I had nothing, to become a president. I was a poor presidential candidate who had never gained a position in the government. I was never accused of corruption whatsoever. This is not a virtue, it's just an obligation of mine as a politician. The left wing was unable to hold me back because I started working 4 years before the election. They tried to kill me. My nickname in the army was the Big Horse because I was a very robust man in the army, and thank God I was able to resist the attack. I won the elections, and many people would say at the time, if I did not negotiate some ministries as well as state-owned companies and government banks with Congress, my life would be short-lived in politics. And I have spent the past 2 years and 8 months without having to negotiate or give and take with Congress. I treat them with great respect, and we do have a few politicians who happen to be cabinet ministers, but then again, these are ministers who have a very upright track record as politicians, that they're capable, you know. I spent 28 years in Congress, and I have shown here in the executive branch that in a country like Brazil, if you have a goal to reach and if you make an effort, you do achieve your purpose, you do achieve your goal. But I must admit to you that my life has become virtually hell. But I am very happy, and I am comforted by the fact that we do not have anyone from the Workers' Party or from the left wing occupying the presidential seat, because during the pandemic, they would have done in Brazil what has been going on in Argentina. We know Argentina has taken on a stance to shut down everything, lock down everything. I was perhaps the only head of state in the world that was against, total lockdown and confinement. I said that we had to face up to the virus and fight it. And I also said that we had two problems to be addressed simultaneously and with the same responsibility. On the one hand, the virus that could kill, and also unemployment, which can also kill people. Today, the population already recognized that is the case, and everything I have said about the pandemic, unlike the whole world out there, little by little, people have recognized that I was right. A mídia, a grande imprensa tradicional, diz que a sua política aqui no Brasil contra a Covid foi ruim. Mas, em comparação com a Argentina, por exemplo, acredito que os números são bem próximos, bem parecidos. Mas aqui não teve o lockdown, o fechamento absoluto. Aqui no Brasil, só deixou a liberdade de escolha prevalecer, certo? When the virus came upon us, no one really knew much about it. And the same is true today. We don't know everything about it yet. And I gathered people here in live sessions, talked to a lot of doctors, even called people outside of Brazil, and I asked, why do fewer people die in your country? And we came to the conclusion that it was possible to introduce early treatment. Any disease, I mean, if you start, showing or presenting with 30-degree fever, you have to seek immediate treatment. You shouldn't wait until the fever gets to 40. Or when a woman has, a breast pain or issue, she doesn't have to wait until such time as the tumor, becomes as big as a quail egg. She can go to the doctor immediately. And if a man has problem, urinating or peeing, he has to look for treatment, to look into his prostate. Because if the tumor evolves, of course, the cancer can metastasize and it won't help. He will die. And the same is true for COVID. When we talk about scientific evidence, it's pretty easy to talk about that. But take a look, for example, at what happened during the Pacific War. Soldiers would come wounded to the barracks. They needed blood transfusion, but there was no donor, no blood donor. And doctors decided to experiment and inject coconut water in their veins. And many soldiers were saved. I have come to the conclusion, together with people near me, that hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, if administered early on, could serve the purpose of preventing or curing COVID. I was struck by COVID myself, and I was feeling unwell on the second and third day, and the doctor told me, hey, you're showing serious symptoms of COVID. Let us conduct an examination, shall we? And I said, no, before the examination, I want to take ivermectin. The exam would take 24 or 36 hours. So I went ahead and took chloroquine as an early treatment. When the positive result came, I was already cured. In this palace, about 200 people were hit by COVID. I'm not sure whether due to my influence, because I'm not a doctor, but of course they knew and know what happens with the boss, and that is true anywhere. And here in the palace, many people took something, either hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin. No one even had to go to the hospital because of that early treatment. I have been given talks all over Brazil, usually 200, 300 people. And I ask in the audience, who has had COVID? And about 70% of the members of the audience raised their hands. And I ask, who among you took hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin? Almost everyone raised their hand. So why this negative reaction against hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin? Just because it's cheap? If it were a $2,000 medication, would it be good? We know how the pharmaceutical industry works all over the world. Brazil's health surveillance agency, Anvisa, you also have your own in Germany, a similar agency. We have changed their profile and role. I assigned a doctor and a admiral to lead the agency as the president. So the agency already worked pretty well, but they have actually enhanced their credibility. When I am criticized for COVID treatment, you have to bear in mind that the approximate figures in Brazil are as follows. One person with COVID in a government-run public hospital costs about 2,000 Brazilian reais in the ICU per day. For other diseases, the cost is about 1,000 Brazilian reais on average, half of the cost. So many humble, poor people, when they would go to the doctor and have to be admitted to hospital, they would be sent to the ICU bed, to the ICU section, because the hospital would get more money. So there was an over-reporting, and you can only learn about over-reporting in hindsight 2 or 3 years later. So it happened, and the number of deaths was actually boosted and overdone in Brazil. It is a fact of life. Even people out there will tell you, hey, my mother did not die of COVID. They died of something else, but they wrote COVID on the death certificate. Very often, to more easily release the dead body, they said COVID. There was no autopsy. It was cheaper for the hospital not to conduct any autopsy. So many things happened to overdo the number of deaths for COVID. Many people already had some kind of comorbidity going on before they died. So COVID probably shortened their lives by a few days or a few weeks. We regret all deaths, of course. But of course, we know many people who were doing well did die. But it is a reality. It was a worldwide wave against early treatment. And of course, I ended up paying a very high price for advocating this approach without being a doctor, of course. But it's...
The media is attacking you
A imprensa vem atacando o senhor em todo o mundo. E o que o senhor acha sobre como é que o senhor ou como nós podemos encontrar uma forma de ter uma imprensa mais baseada em fatos e menos baseada em ideologia política? Como é que podemos, digamos, romper essa máfia da imprensa, da mídia? Se me permite, o senhor estaria disposto a falar, por exemplo, com a imprensa alemã, se tiver a oportunidade, para poder ilustrar o retrato correto do Brasil, para pintar um quadro certo do Brasil? Well, let's say, what can I possibly say about the media in Brazil? Well, when I took office, we had the constitutional amendment talking about spending cap, the spending cap where the government cannot possibly spend more than that amount, the spending cap or ceiling. And that cap has been going down, increasingly down, or if you will, the floor has been going up, if you understand me. So we had to consider where we could spend less to make sure funds were available to spend on more important things. And the media, absorbed about more than 2 million Brazilian reais every year in Brazil, a lot of money. And I said, no, let's spend only 10% of that amount. Of course, mainstream media did not like that. Mainstream television networks in Brazil did not like that. There's also, of course, the ideology factor. I am a former Brazilian Army captain. When I took office back in 1991 as a federal member of the House of Representatives, at that point in time, many people who had enjoyed amnesty from the military period in Brazil many people were elected as members of Congress, senators, members of the House, and they had a lot of hard feelings, and they saw me as a former Army member as their favorite target to criticize. Very often I was there all by myself against 30 members of Congress in the discussions. And that's where the ideology creeps in. There's also a very close relationship with the left wing in Brazil. I even showed this passage in a book drafted by an army colonel working with the Cuban Fidel Castro Secret Service, and he had to flee Cuba to enjoy a more peaceful life, because things were pretty bad for him even after he retired in Cuba. And this former Cuban colonel said something very interesting in his book. He said everyone in the world, authorities, government officials who visited Cuba and stayed in one of the most important most important hotels in Cuba, they were all taped. And if you stayed in that hotel with your wife, you were on tape. But then again, as a couple, not a problem. But you still were taped. Now, if you took a man to the hotel, or a child, a 10 or 12-year-old child, to your room in the hotel, you would have become hostage to the Cuban regime. And many Brazilians, members of the artistic and political world, attended and went to these hotels in Cuba and were taped. They were caught on tape. So according to this book drafted by this former Cuban colonel, they are held hostage to the system. And then under the Dilma Rousseff administration, he had this program called More Doctors. And Cuba sent to Brazil about 12,000 Cuban doctors at that time. About 75% of their wages were directly sent to the Cuban dictatorial regime. They retained only 25% of their wages as doctors. And when an executive order was voted, or a bill of law was voted in Congress, an executive order is a bill of law that has dint of law. One of the articles contained so many aberrations, saying that if anyone asked for asylum in Brazil, these Cuban doctors would be immediately deported from Brazil back to Cuba. So the Cubans came here with support of the Brazilian parliament, a parliament that spoke so much about democracy. And if a Cuban citizen decided to desert and not go back, he would be immediately deported back to Cuba. I even tried to ensure that these 12,000 Cubans would get a wage in a government bank, an official government bank, but my proposal was defeated because the money would not be deposited in their personal account. And they came here without any evidence as to whether or not they were real and trained doctors. A substantial number of them were Cuban Secret Service agents to surveil the situation domestically in Brazil. They started to establish these cells within Brazil, co-opt Brazilian citizens, and introduce their ideology, and try to showcase that Cuba was so good, and that the Cuban regime were introduced in Brazil, things would be outstanding. I was the one man fighting against that. So yes, the ideology does weigh against me to a certain extent. But then again, you may ask the question, how did I get elected president? I mean, I didn't have a party, I had very little time on TV, no marketing professional, and had spent the last 30 days before the election in hospital. So how did I get elected? Well, a miracle happened, really. A doctor saved me in the city of Juiz de Fora, where the attack happened, and they told me that, this virtually 20-centimeter blade that was used to stab me, was very close to vital veins in my body. It would have been almost impossible, to recover from that huge attack. I had a lot of blood loss, but did recover. I'm not crying, of course, I'm not complaining. I am a former army captain. I know about the war, I know about death, and dying is part of the game. I know dying is part of the game. But I was saved as a result of a miracle. And if you remember, say, some 3-4 years ago, every week, you would hear about 2 or 3 different cases of corruption being publicized in Brazil. We have had no corruption case in Brazil for 2 years and 8 months. Take a look at 2015, for example. The losses incurred by state-owned companies and the profits gained by state-owned companies in 2019, the difference comes to about 100 billion Brazilian reals. The difference is in the order of about 20 billion US dollars, which would be embezzled in the past. And that's the kind of country we received when we took office. In the past, you had the former Workers' Party administrations. And the Workers' Party had Congress in their hands because they would grant, key positions of state-owned companies. These were state-owned companies that operated with million figures. So they enjoyed support from Congress. Not so much in my case. Virtually no parties except, of course, if Brazil does well, we all do well. It serves no purpose for you to be financially wealthy if you are unable to take to the streets because of the sheer violence out in the streets or because of the sheer poverty of the population at large. It would be like Cuba. I mean, in Cuba, you have areas that are physically reserved for tourists. They don't really see the everyday life. So I try to show that and talk about freedom and what the potential path ahead would be, and also showcasing what was going on in Venezuela, and also showcasing what is unfortunately beginning to happen in Argentina, and unfortunately was also beginning to happen in Chile. And we don't want to follow suit. We don't want to be the next country in line. And while talking to Trump, he expressed huge concern against Venezuela. Of course, we had this private one-on-one talk I cannot discuss in public, but I would tell him about the concern we also have towards Venezuela. But then again, Brazil cannot follow suit in the same pathway. We must move away from the left wing. And how do we move away from the left wing? Well, we can engage in a broad-ranging economic agreement, bringing the North and the South together in this hemisphere. In Brazil, we have things and resources that no one has in the world. But to tap into these resources and add value to these resources and goods, we don't want to be just exporters of commodities. And to do that, we need to have a friendly, democratic country and capable from a warfare perspective on our side. I cannot possibly talk about nuclear issues because the world would criticize me very strongly. Although we are going through a water crisis due to lack of rainfall, we do not really see the forests catching fire in the Amazonian region, as is the case in the wetlands, because the Amazon region is a rainforest by definition. Very often the fire outbreaks are the result of the local population and their typical practice in agriculture. They set some fields afire. And the same is true for some indigenous people. But when there are fire outbreaks in California, no one says anything. The same kind of fire outbreaks occur in some states in the US and also in Europe, and no one says anything. In Brazil, many of the fire outbreaks happen, for example, as a result of bans, illegal bans. For example, when you ban cattle from grazing on the wetlands, a huge area, that means that the cattle will no longer eat up or consume combustible or inflammable organic matter. And when fires emerge later on, it's appalling. I may ask you, for example, what about the riverside vegetation in the Amazonian region? There is no such thing as a riverside or riparian vegetation in Brazil. You don't have that in Europe. We have it in Brazil, but not so much in Europe. In the past, people would talk about reforesting areas in Brazil, and I would ask them, why don't you try to reforest your country? In Brazil, virtually 60% of our original vegetation is preserved. In other countries, less than 10%. In Europe, you need reforestation, not so much in Brazil. We are actively working, and bear in mind, the Amazonian region is larger than Western Europe. And of course, it can be very challenging, very difficult for you to contain the potential for fire outbreaks in the forest. Primeiramente, queria retomar as perguntas sobre Covid, porque a mídia tradicional na Europa vem dizendo que o senhor esqueceu os povos indígenas em matéria de saúde, matéria sanitária. Então, gostaria de perguntar, há algum plano, alguma intenção de fazer as vacinas chegarem aos povos indígenas no Brasil? The indigenous are spread out virtually throughout the 8.5 million square kilometers of this country. About 4 or 5 months ago, I visited the Amazonian region in a town called São Gabriel da Cachoeira, which is actually larger than many European countries, by the way. And I talked to the Tucano and to the Yanomami indigenous people, and I asked who had the virus. More than half of them raised their hands saying yes. How did you get treated? That was back in 2020. Vaccination started in early 2021. And they said we got treated with tea, our herbal tree from biodiversity, local biodiversity, and the barks of trees. And no one died among them. No one had died among them.
As vacinas, nós oferecemos para...
We did make vaccines available and offered them to the indigenous people. Many people say I am in negationism and did not buy vaccines in 2020. Did Germany buy any vaccines in 2020? No one did. I'm just getting information that 88% of the indigenous people in Brazil are currently vaccinated. So yes, we did our part and even provided them with foodstuffs and social isolation. Now, if you get 8.5 million contaminated people, in hundreds and hundreds of indigenous villages, how can you possibly take care of that basically with the armed forces? It is no easy task, but we did treat them very well, and we have no news that deaths may have happened in villages, certainly not beyond the national domestic average. Much on the contrary, the average of deaths was below the national average. Obrigado. Minha outra pergunta, presidente, sobre o seguinte: como a vacina é uma vacina experimental, imunização experimental, eu entendo que o senhor defende o livre-arbítrio para tomar a vacina. Nos Estados Unidos, os membros das Forças Armadas são obrigados a ser vacinados por medida provisória nos Estados Unidos. Então me pergunta, algum plano aqui no Brasil no sentido de obrigar as vacinas junto ao pessoal, ou soldados, pessoal militar, ou policiais, por exemplo? Well, if it depends on me, vaccine will always be optional. I will not mandate or oblige anyone to be vaccinated. How can I mandate that people take the coronavac vaccine if there is no scientific evidence of its efficacy? It would be preposterous. It is an experimental vaccine. People talk about hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, but they talk about side effects, and some people would even say, or used to say, that hydroxychloroquine would cause heart arrhythmia. The European Heart Society has stated that it does not cause heart arrhythmia. So it was rejected on that one side. And these two medications were not designed specifically to fight COVID. Now, the major discoveries in science, especially for erectile dysfunction, were accidental, very largely, to a large extent. Many medications that were discovered, were accidentally used for or experimentally used for certain diseases, and have now been more widely studied and used. So there is no rationale, for that charge that I am a negationist or was, just because I did not show much concern about the vaccine. No, I'm totally concerned about the vaccine. And I myself haven't taken the vaccine yet. I am 66 years old. I walk among people and I took my IgG examination. It was 991. I must have been reinfected and did not even notice. Now, studies indicate, reliable studies indicate that those who have been contaminated by the COVID virus currently present with more antibodies than those who did not, 6 times more. So I'm in that one group of people, and I am concerned about the virus. I've also said that we have to face up to the virus. We cannot hide under the bed. The WHO said a few weeks ago that we have to learn with and from the virus. Congratulations, WHO. Sometimes they get it right, and they did in that statement. No one has a crystal ball. In Brazil, there seems to be this mindset where people thought that if you stayed home, confined and under lockdown at home and under curfew, the virus would go away. And I've always said it won't go away. It would be very easy for me because I have a comfortable house. I don't even have to pay to use the presidential palace. I have everything, available to me there. It would be very comfortable for me to just stay at home and watch the people, do what they could. And I went out there to meet with the people from day one. At least once a week, I would meet with people without even wearing a mask because I want to talk to the people firsthand. And I would tell them, don't get appalled, don't get scared. You have to face up to the virus. Governors and mayors at orders issued by the Federal Supreme Court were given the right to retain people at home. And I would tell them, how can you keep in their homes people who work in the morning to get food in the evening so that they can eat and survive? We launched the emergency aid program whereby 68 million people were granted the emergency aid. We spent 320 billion Brazilian reals, which roughly means about 50 billion US dollars. Brazil is a rich country in natural resources, but economically we're not that rich. So we assisted these people because we didn't want them to starve to death or take to the streets and cause more serious problems to public property, for example, as was the case in the past. For example, when people would invade and loot supermarkets, there was no single supermarket looted in Brazil. I did assist and help the poorest in the population. I did what many governors and mayors did not do. So I rest in peace with my own mind and with my own consciousness. And the stay home policy, unlike other countries, we have formal working documents. And these people just lose their jobs if they stayed home. I put in place programs to keep them working by lowering the workload while, of course, ensuring that they would retain their jobs. The number of employees, for example, in bars and restaurants and in the tourism industry is huge. We were able to keep these people working and employed. According to our calculations, 11 million people never lost their jobs because of our aid. So there should be no complaining. They just, created or made up corruption involving that one vaccine procurement. Not one single criminal offense was perpetrated. It's more or less like telling you, you will die, and just use my finger as a threat. You won't die, so no crime. Now, many people, of course, felt uncomfortable because I put an end to corruption. Corruption may happen, and if it does happen, we will certainly help ensure that it will be investigated and, of course, forwarded to the judicial authorities, of course. And so far, we have had 0 cases of corruption under my administration. Genial, ótimo ouvir isso, presidente. Eu sou ex-integrante das Forças Armadas e amanhã marca o 20º ano desde o acidente, ou os incidentes de 11 de setembro nos Estados Unidos, quando os afegãos e os americanos foram atacados, enfim. O que o senhor acha que é a perspectiva que deve ocorrer e se desdobrar daqui por diante no Afeganistão? September 11th, yes, we were all there and monitored what happened. Terrible episode. Now, the question regarding Afghanistan, of course, we were all very concerned because they got hold of a huge war arsenal in their state apparatus. It may have a ripple effect all over the world, and we may see a comeback of terrorist actions. We have no influence whatsoever on what happens there. As, or unlike the United States, they have always had an influence in a few other countries as well. We hope nothing will happen, but of course the level of concern has gone up substantially as regards a potential comeback of terrorist actions worldwide. Sou também ex-integrante das Forças Armadas e a imprensa tradicional da Europa critica o senhor pelo seu perfil de ex-membro do Exército. E o que o senhor pensa a esse respeito? Quando se serve um país nas Forças Armadas, faz-se um sacrifício pelo país. O senhor diria que é uma crítica injusta, essa que se ouve na imprensa, a seu respeito? What is democracy all about? It's about running for office, and if you get elected, you or your election will be respected. Back in 1999, the Ministry of Defense was established in Brazil, and only 3 members of Congress voted against the proposal among 513. I was one of the 3. The Ministry of Defense was established not due to any military need or requirement, but due to a top-down political imposition. In Brazil, up until then, we had the military household, or the military offices, including the Ministry of the Navy, Army, and the Armed Forces, and the Chiefs of Staff. We had 5 members of the military in the ministerial head table, and they could be a hindrance in talks to, of course, meet shady interests that would not prove appropriate or good for Brazil. So it would be best to address these issues without members of the military. So they established the Ministry of Defense, whereby the Minister of Defense could be anyone. And it became a civilian. The minister appointed was a civilian. The first minister appointed to that position was a former senator, a senator who had not been re-elected. In other words, they didn't even appoint, a high prestige civilian person, but just this one senator who had failed to be re-elected. And this was the trend up until the Temer administration. People holding positions, top-ranking positions in the Ministry of Defense were enemies vis-a-vis the armed forces. We even had one member of Congress who was affiliated with the Brazilian Communist Party. So we had, of course, a tug-of-war and a battle in the Araguaia River back in the 1970s. So what was their purpose? The purpose was to deteriorate and cause wear and tear in the armed forces. They then established the so-called Truth Commission, where the left wing told their version with the purpose of humiliating and deteriorating the image of the armed forces. And why was that the case? Well, because we, the armed forces, are the last obstacle against authoritarianism. And the armed forces in Brazil survived virtually as a result of a miracle as well, because the wear and tear and the constant criticism from the media was tremendous. But we have survived. Under the Temer administration before me, he appointed the first army general, the highest ranking general, to be the Minister of Defense. And he is currently the president of Brazil's oil company, Petrobras. And I currently have a 4-star general as the Minister of the Defense. And this was a source of discomfort to the Brazilian left wing. It is a source of discomfort to the corrupted people out there in politics, because the corruption among the military is infinitely less than among civilians. So that means it is more difficult for them to try to do what they did in the past. It is certainly an unfair criticism. Dilma Rousseff appointed many people who were former guerrilla members. Dilma Rousseff's first husband, who was he? Cláudio Dalena. Who was this man? He is still alive. While flying the Argentinian airspace, he hijacked the plane and then landed in a country that was not at all a democratic country, Cuba, believe it or not. So many people who were appointed here were active members of the armed forces in the past, guerrilla members. Even Dilma Rousseff herself, José Dirceu, for example, was a reliable person in the eyes of the Cuban regime, and he held a very important position here as a chief minister at the presidency. Many corrupted people held positions here or became corrupted under the Lula or Dilma Rousseff administration. And the armed force, of course, did their part and played their role, of course, very much concerned about their duty as provided for under an article in the federal constitution. Now, when I appointed people to these positions, I appointed people who were friends of mine. Yes, I could have appointed corrupt people, but why should I not be able to appoint members of the military who are uprighteous people? And the members of the military, together with the good and uprighteous civilians who are appointed here, do help us put an end to corruption, as was the case in the past. In the past, corruption here, as we know, corruption is the source of a lot of wear and tear in this country. And people sometimes just criticize because they like to criticize. If a member of the military does something wrong, they will pay for it. I've had cabinet ministers who are members of the military. I won't go into details here, but anyway, they were dismissed from office because they started to criticize me. And very often, the press uses that example, plus a few other examples of ministers who say, or to say that militaries are being criticized, and they always, of course, refer to my name. But still, I enjoy great peace of mind. I'm very happy with the 23 cabinet ministers I have. There are many members of the military, yes. And there has indeed been an increase in the members of the military in the second and third echelon in government. But no worries, because the chance of corrupting a member of the military is there, yes, but it's much lower. O senhor acha, então, presidente, por que o senhor acha que a mídia tradicional publicou um artigo no jornal Guardian, segunda-feira última, dizendo que o senhor usa os militares para apoiá-lo durante as manifestações no dia da independência. O senhor estava lá em São Paulo e o protesto foi muito pacífico, livre, sem violência. Então, as pessoas estavam ali para apoiá-lo e comemorar o dia 7 de setembro. Eu diria então que temos aí uma agenda da esquerda junto com a imprensa tradicional para colocar o senhor nesse fogo cruzado entre direita e esquerda, ou colocar o senhor meio que no escaninho da direita, na caixinha da direita, por assim dizer, e usar isso contra o senhor por ocasião das próximas eleições?
Olha, em qualquer lugar que eu vá,
no matter where I go, of course I have my security team that follows me. I will be going to the beach in a few more days, and of course they'll be with me anywhere I go.
Eu sou democrata. 7 governadores proibiram.
I am a Democrat, and 7 governors banned members of the state-level military to attend or go to the demonstrations, and if they did, they would be expelled from the military corporation. And I said, well, fine. We probably did have many members of the military who were off duty on that day in the demonstrations and protests. But I have been given information that in other demonstrations, many members of the military do go. And as you see, in the history of this country, you don't really see reference to anyone being wounded or assaulted or any depredation of a bank outlet or vandalizing of public property. So peaceful movements. People seem to be missing violence. And when the left goes, or the left wing, takes to the street in a few more days, be sure there will be a lot of problems. The police stations very often document a lot of thefts of smartphones when these left-wing sponsored demonstrations happen. As regards Lula, former President Lula, for example, there's ample evidence indicating that those people who spoke against him and contributed to the investigations, about $12 billion or $12 billion were returned. It doesn't happen among members of the military. And if it does, we don't hear about it. And these people, the left-wing people, have survived at the cost, at the expense of the Brazilian state apparatus. The landless people movement, the MST movement, they have invaded property. But you don't really see them active in my government because I put an end to the sources of funding that they got from NGOs. It is like depriving them of gas or fuel for their car, so they're no longer able to do much. While in Congress, Congress passed weapons to be carried by people, and carrying weapon was only allowed within one's household or property. From 2020 onwards, you can even use a rifle. An upright citizen can, of course, buy a rifle and walk around his property carrying a rifle. And as a result, violence has gone down in Brazil, since uprighteous people are now allowed to carry weapons. The least violent state in Brazil is that of Santa Catarina in southern Brazil, among the 27 states. They have shooters, they have hunters, and they have targets, and no one would even consider burglarizing your home because they know you can be armed with a weapon. And of course that means threats no longer prevail once weapons have become part of our peaceful coexistence. I have often said in Brazil that all dictatorships all over the world were preceded by disarmament campaigns. I'm doing precisely the opposite. Why is it that uprighteous citizens, good-willing people, are good people? Well, because they will prevent any president from imposing a military or dictatorship or dictatorial regime in Brazil. It will never happen in the United States. I believe that the people in the US are actually bigger and more important than the army. This is what I think, and this is what I believe has worked in Brazil.
So next year there is the big election again in your country.
Ano que vem temos uma grande eleição novamente no Brasil e receio que possa ocorrer a mesma tendência com relação à fraude eleitoral que se viu nos Estados Unidos. Vimos, por exemplo, que nos Estados Unidos alguns queriam usar um voto impresso para ter uma prova física concreta de que votaram para a pessoa que queriam votar. e não voto eletrônico num equipamento que pode ser facilmente hackeada.
As informações que nós temos,
Well, the information we have about the United States is that many people voted more than once through the mail.
chegaram notícias e
We got those news that something wrong happened in the United States, but I won't meddle with elections in the U.S.
nós temos
Now, concerning Brazil now, we do have an election system, according to two technical reports by the Federal Police Service, that the system is not open to any auditing. It cannot be audited. So we have tried to ensure that the voting can become transparent, auditable, reliable. The president of the Electoral Supreme Court is against that proposal. And I've had 2 live sessions on this matter in Brazil. The second live session, I included documents issued by the Electoral Supreme Court indicating that hackers spent 8 months in their Electoral Supreme Court computers, 8 months before the 2018 elections. Documents issued by the Electoral Court itself. And the Information Technology Director himself, in an official letter to the Federal Police Service, said that the records or logs were deleted. And even the fingerprints were deleted.
Então, o que nós tentamos fazer?
So what did we try to do then?
Ter sistema
We,
confiável.
of course, want to try to have a reliable voting system. The president of the Electoral Supreme Court is against that proposal because he says that the system is reliable. But just a few days ago, he stated that they're enhancing the system. If they're enhancing, that's because the system had flaws. So why are we engaged in this battle? Or because we want the next year elections to be such that no one will later say, hey, there is a suspicion of fraud.
E acredito que
And I believe that
uma proposta
when we
blindar mais
submit
ainda
a
possibilidade de
proposal to protect us against the possibility of fraud, I think we will approve it or pass it. Brazil is a wonderful country. We feed more than 1 million people worldwide.
fraude. Tem alguns países
And there are countries, some countries out there that would like to, of course, prevail
para alguns países
and have a dominant position in Brazilian agriculture, if you understand me. For some countries, it would be good, if the president of Brazil were more friendly to them. I am not necessarily friendly to them. I want good business to take place for everyone, and I want to make sure our sovereignty is preserved and guaranteed.
tem causado algum
So this stance has caused some noise in the Brazilian politics. I am accused of engaging in anti-democratic actions just because I talk about the potential for fraud in electronic voting. And we have everything
vai pegar no papel, levar para
you
casa,
need
o papel,
to
automaticamente entra outro.
couple a printer next to the electronic voting machine.
Confiou?
You can have both, not a problem. If you have a suspicion, you can check. But if there is no suspicion, just congratulate your opponent and go away. That's what I advocate.
Isso lançou
Now,
uma nuvem
this ended up, of course,
que poderia ter sido
launching a cloud of suspicion on what happens or may happen in Brazilian elections. I am, however, sure that we will be able to hold elections next year and tally votes
para quem você votou.
and make sure that the votes will be, of course, tallied for those for whom you or voters actually voted. And on September the 7th, our National Independent Day, we heard the message. A huge number of people out there in the street asking for and calling for auditable voting that can be tallied in public.
So, what is your message to the world?
Qual seria o seu recado para o mundo,
You
presidente?
want to show because it's really hard.
Afinal, é
from the media,
muito
because
difícil
the media
do
is
ponto de vista da
talking
imprensa,
about
porque a imprensa sempre
you.
fala
What
sobre o
would you
senhor,
say,
não está do seu
to the
lado.
world?
Então,
What do you want you to say?
o que o senhor diria ao mundo? Qual seria o seu recado?
A maior rede de televisão do Brasil é Globo.
Brazil's largest television network is the Global Network. I've told Globo, I will give a live interview, and they don't want it. They do not want.
Para deturpar
Because they want to be able to distort anything I say.
respeito todos os jornais. Poucos jornais sérios.
I do not believe in, many journalists. There are very few serious journalists out there. I do not believe in a news article or a newscast where the reporter himself is giving his view and opinion and not really reporting on what was really said. People are doing well in Brazil. Of course, yes, we do have some inflation problems. I will not deny that. But as regards democracy, this country is pretty much at peace. We are in peace. and believe in Brazil and come here and visit. When people talk about fire outbreaks in the Amazon region or in the wetlands, the rainforest cannot possibly catch fire. They do that, of course, to deteriorate our image. There is this one country that has an interest, and they compete with us on agricultural commodities, and they want us to experience a wear and tear and deterioration. Many people say, I won't buy anything from Brazil because of the fire outbreaks in the Amazon region. What are you talking about? The moon in Mars or Saturn? I mean, this is absolute fiction. We preserve almost 80% of our territory. We had food security and we provide foodstuffs to people worldwide, about 1 million people. We also have a bill of law going through Congress now, allowing indigenous people, if they so wish, to use their land to do the same thing that farmers do next door, including gold mining, gold panning, farming, animal husbandry. And many indigenous people are with us. They're on our side. There are people, indigenous people out there who are happy and they're excited and they're already working, even before the law is passed. And we want indigenous people to, of course, earn their money and produce food and engage in productive-oriented activities. The same country out there, has engaged in a campaign to prevent people from buying anything from the indigenous people. We don't want the indigenous people to be or become like animals in the zoo. Come and visit Brazil. You can even travel the area using a hovercraft. You will enjoy a tremendous and wonderful trip by hovercraft in the Amazon region. You have a standing invitation to come and visit the region, and you will have my endorsement.
Maybe one thing, if I ask one more question.
Se me permite mais uma pergunta, vemos muita solidariedade entre as pessoas em todo mundo, porque viajamos muito. As pessoas têm solidariedade lutando em prol da liberdade. Qual seria o seu anúncio, presidente, para essas pessoas que lutam um combate em prol da liberdade e são oprimidas? Freedom is something you don't lose overnight. It's more or less like marriage. You don't lose it overnight. You have to take care of it, otherwise it'll lose. You lose it. And this is not something I said, but I've heard it said that if you give up a little bit of your freedom today for more security or safety, you will end up having no freedom and no safety or security. It's very much like the vaccine. You cannot mandate or oblige anyone to take the vaccine, because if it is his life that is at stake, let him or her take care of his life and I'll take care of mine. I'll be the last person to take the vaccine in Brazil, especially because I want to show that there are many people who did not take the vaccine and were appalled about it, but many have. About 18-year-old people are now eligible to vaccination. And below 18 years, we have to look into the scientific evidence, because young people have natural immunity. People without freedom are people with no life. Freedom is actually more important than life, because someone deprived of freedom cannot live. That's the maxim I have always preached, and I encourage everyone to act along these lines. And the same is true for weapons or arms. What does the left wing do when they want to ban something? They want to ban it for everyone. Now, when we do not want something to happen, what do? We do not hinder. We allow everyone to buy what they want. Use your weapon if you want. And ever since the election campaign, I was charged with the media of being homophobic and not liking gay people, or being misogynist, not liking women, racist, not liking people of African descent, not liking people from northeastern Brazil. I was accused of all bad things you could possibly imagine, and I could not possibly react against all that. Now, maybe my example as a member of Congress for 20 years may serve as an example for many things. I never failed to express my opinion after looking into a matter. I didn't just issue an opinion after just being asked the question. I think more than a criminal offense, it would be stupid to answer about something you are not aware of. I even quoted a biblical reference, John 8:32. And thou shalt know the truth, and the truth shalt make you free, or set you free. This news reporter who was with me said, if you talk about truth, you won't really get anywhere, because people are now used to sweet lies. Things like, hey, you're good looking, I'm going to get you a job. And I'm going to improve your standard of living. Now, standards of living in Brazil can only be improved by people themselves at their own initiative. It serves no purpose to have a wonderful educational system in Brazil if people are not willing to study. It serves no purpose to give a Formula One car if the pilot cannot drive the car. They won't get anywhere. So, question of freedom is absolutely key. If we had not taken measures in favor of economic freedom in 2019, we would have faced disaster in 2020. We are the fifth ranking country that has least suffered with the measures as a result of COVID because of the measures we had taken back in 2019 and later in 2020. So we try to, of course, set an example in our government. My Olympic pool, swimming pool, no longer uses electric warming or heating. Spending with foodstuffs has also gone substantially down. And the only wrong thing I oftentimes do is to run away using my motorcycle in Brasilia. I enjoy it. And I think it's about time for me to, get away. I'm going to get my security team to, keep an eye on me. I'll try to use that motorcycle in a few more days. I do like riding motorcycles. It's all about freedom. It's an outstanding and wonderful feeling of, riding your bike 120 kilometers and enjoying the view around you. It's just absolute freedom. And same is true for diving, deep diving. 10 meters below the surface, and you can hear music and look, to the infinite before you. I'm also a former parachuter. I like it. I try to, leap, but the armed forces, the heads of the armed forces try to hold me back and not allow me. But I will have a parachuting leap in the local lake, and my aide-de-camp will be with me. And they, of course, want me to avoid a fracture due to osteoporosis. So my doctor recommends I don't, but I will. If you don't end the interview, there's no lunch.
No, I think we
have
everything you want to ask.
Acho que já cobrimos tudo que queríamos perguntar, presidente. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Muito obrigado pela oportunidade concedida para podermos ouvir a visão da sua pessoa, porque na imprensa interna na Alemanha a gente só ouve sobre o senhor, mas agora a gente vê quem o senhor é muito bom poder, enfim, ilustrar isso para o mundo. If I were everything people say I am, not so many people would have turned out in my favor on the 7th of September. I also have a great grandfather who is of German origin, Haintz. É verdade, ele é de Hamburgo, sabemos. E o seu filho informou, Karl Haintz é o nome dele, né, de Hamburgo, o seu bisavô. Yeah. Seu filho me contou. Muito obrigado pelo tempo dispensado. Um prazer, obrigado. Shall we have lunch?
Yes.